Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Gaming the System, the podcast where three intersectional feminists examine gaming and games through a feminist lens. Today I'm your host Alex and I'm joined by Matt. Before we get started, if you want to support us, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gamingthesystem for some exclusive content. Or you can send us a one-off donation via PayPal to our email address wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com. So Matt, we're talking about gaming news. What's your first story of the week?
So we're going to start off in the world of basketball. I don't think either of us are particularly big basketball fans, but this story sort of transcends the world of sport in terms of women's power in sport versus institutional power that has and the roles that those two things are playing. So there's a woman named Caitlin Clark. She's 22 and she's just graduated from the University of Iowa, and she has broken dozens of records in her 4-year tenure at the University of Iowa. She's scored out of all college athletes in history, men and women, she has scored the most total points over the course of her 4-year career there. She the last 2 years she took her team to the grand final of all the big knockout tournament, and the view count of this tournament went from the year before she arrived, so 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, it was 5 million viewers, and then the following year, 2 years ago, doubled to 10 million.
Wow. Yeah.
Because she was there. Wow. And then the following year she got them there again, and it had doubled again to 20 million.
Oh my God.
And it's been called the Caitlin Clark effect.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's insane. Had any of this filtered through to you?
It had actually, ironically enough. I was listening to Andy Roddick's new podcast, the former tennis player from America. His podcast Served, where he just talks to journalist John Wertheim about what's been happening every week on the tennis tour, and they talked about women's tennis and the age-old debate of should women be paid the same even though they play less, and Andy and John were arguing how ridiculous that argument is because of all the other factors that may or may not have been talked about on this podcast, that basically it's not just about the amount of games in a match. It's lots of other different factors. But they also talked about the Caitlin Clark effect, as you mentioned, Matt, and the amount of people watching basketball because of her and the impact that she's had on the sport, and how women's tennis is technically one of the sports that's the most, quote, progressive in terms of equality with men in that sport, but there are still long way to go in terms of things like a domestic abuse policy as part of the tours, which isn't a thing, but yet there are active players who are still under live allegations and awaiting trial, who are just continuing to play as if nothing has happened. All sorts of other things, many issues across both the women's and the men's tour with outdated rules about the colour of the clothes that you can wear. Wimbledon's rules have only just changed so that you can wear non-white underwear while you play, which will obviously be much better for women who are on their period, for example. All sorts of different ways. But yeah, they definitely talked about that in comparison to tennis, and where tennis is perhaps lagging behind in terms of marketing women's sport as equal, if not better, than men's sport.
Yeah, this marks perfectly the difference between the power of an athlete, of an individual, compared to the power of an institution.
Yeah.
So the problem with tennis is that the institution has all of the power. Even none of the female athletes have enough individual power to overcome the institutional bias against them, which is shown by when Serena Williams gets angry at something, the entire mainstream media and all of the institutions of tennis say, oh, this angry black woman being all stroppy, she needs to behave herself. Whereas with Caitlin Clark, the NBA could say whatever they want. If she got angry on court, the NBA could say, well, this angry, silly woman, all the media could say it. But they couldn't touch her at all because she has such tremendous personal power. Her personal brand gives her, makes her, she's the one in charge. The NBA and all the institutions around it are desperate for her approval because they need it. Because if she says, this league's disgusting, I'm going to start my own league, that would do tremendous damage to them, and that's the starting point for things to be changed.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the case in tennis?
I think there's an awful lot going on in tennis at the moment that will make big changes, but not necessarily in the ways that I want it to change. So we've talked, I think, before about the involvement of Saudi Arabia and a potential Saudi-funded tour and or Saudi finals. You know, they've got them for the next generation ATP, and now it's been announced for the WTA finals, a 3-year deal to take place in Saudi Arabia. So clearly there have been plans for a long time for Saudi to get involved in tennis, and that's kind of now coming to fruition. But there's also, they've been looking into a rival tour, a bit like golf with the Live Tour, a Premier Tour, I think it's been called, which a lot of the slams are apparently in favour. The Grand Slam's the largest 4 tournaments of the year, but it would mean basically cutting down the number of tournaments by nearly, well, I'm not sure exactly how many, but a big chunk of tournaments wouldn't exist anymore because it would be a massively reduced calendar with, I think, 10 other tournaments outside of Grand Slams. And you'd have to be like ranked a certain amount in the rankings to be able to actually play on the Premier Tour. So there's a worry that it will essentially cut out a lot of the lower ranked, like 100 to 200 numbered players who sometimes get big opportunities at places like Grand Slams, but they wouldn't even be able to reach them because of the changes to the ranking system. So there's pros and cons to each offering. Obviously, I don't need to explain, well, I would hope I don't have to explain the cons of having Saudi money involved in promoting tennis as a sport, because all it's doing is sports washing, which has happened with a number of other sports in recent years. The most obvious one is probably golf. But yeah, I mean, the change I would like to see is just making people understand that the value of all forms of tennis, not just men's singles, is actually worth watching. And I think part of that comes from how that tennis is promoted and the platforms that it's given. And if you're not giving that kind of tennis the same platform, then of course it's going to be harder for people to follow it as fans and to get engaged with it and actually watch it. So there's a lot of factors that go into making changes, but I think a lot of it comes down to the way it's promoted and the value that the promoters place on certain different types of tennis. I don't know if that's a really meandering answer to your question, Matt, but yeah, it gives you a picture, really.
Yeah, it just further shows the just the catastrophic damage that institutional power has just demolished women's sports and suppressed it for decade after decade after decade, because the first women's the women's football match that outsold the men's main match 50 years ago, and because those women had no individual power, the powers that be simply went, we don't want that, and crushed it.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's taken women 50 years to grind their way up in spite of institutional bias to a point where they're too big to be crushed by institutions. Now they have bargaining power with it. And this is where Caitlin Clark is causing a massive interesting conversations, is because so she's been signed #1 draft pick, best college player of all time. She's just so it's only in the last 3 years that college athletes have been allowed to profit off of their name, likeness and image.
Wow.
Because of the corruption in America. The entire history of college sport, athletes aren't allowed to be paid for any of it, even though multi-billion-dollar industries, it's just been a slave trade, basically, where they have all of the power. But in the last 3 years, somehow the Supreme Court allowed this, which I think it was just getting to that point where part of the goal of these institutions is to, if they can't stop progress completely, they slow it down as much as they can. And so they finally got to 2021 and go, okay, we'll give them a little bit now. And in her college time of her name, image and likeness, she made $3 million just from that. Yeah. And you think, oh, that's great. But until recently,
that would not have been possible.
That $3 million, that $3 million is still being made. It's just going to the colleges. Yeah. And so that's a good thing. So $3 million before she's even been drafted. Yeah. And she's just signed an 8-year deal with Nike for $28 million.
Yeah, sponsorships are where all the money is, definitely.
Yeah. And on her playing cards and the Nike online gear store sold out almost instantly, just unbelievably.
Yeah.
This is a generational phenomenon. And the men's #1 draft pick of this year got paid $55 million for a 4-year contract. So that's good. Money going up everywhere. Would you like to guess what her 4-year rookie contract's salary is?
I would have absolutely no clue.
Based on those numbers I just gave you, what would you imagine she should have?
Like $500,000 to $750,000 a year? I don't know. I mean...
Bingo.
Yeah, maybe I'm just...
Bingo.
You did say... No, it's completely wrong, isn't it? It's going to be like... I don't even know. Because American salaries are completely different to our salaries, aren't they? They're like...
You got it right on the first go.
Yeah, I did. Oh.
Yeah. So it's $338,000 over 4 years. Dollars over 4 years. But the first thing the NBA said in response was, "Oh, but she can make up to $500,000 if she wins. She can get that amount of bonuses." And that's just wild.
Really?
Absolutely wild.
Yeah. But no, I mean, they show it's really funny. They show the salaries of players when they're doing the warm up in tennis. So you can see like how much they've earned through prize money, and then how much they earn through sponsorship and like advertising and brands and stuff. And usually the brands and things I don't know, actually, they probably don't display that. But usually it's more than prize money. If they're like a really hot player or like a player of the moment that everyone is really keen on watching, then they're going to have massive deals with brands and things. So yeah, but it's so fascinating how much money tennis players make, and indeed other sports people. But I think tennis is one of the most highest paying sports for women that exists currently, which is interesting.
It's one of those, just again, it's when things get better because individuals have more power, that's the good sign. If things are getting slightly better but the institutions still have all the power, which is the case with tennis, and now with Saudi Arabia coming in, it's going to get even worse. They might say, oh, like they do with women in their country, hey, women can drive now, that's great.
Yeah.
It's not because women have risen up and gone, we're demanding the right to drive, we don't care what you say, we're going to start driving, and it doesn't matter what you say or do. But because it's our benevolent overlords mercifully giving us this privilege. But this is an excellent sign, and it's part of a trend, which is good. But we'll have to see where it goes.
Yes, we will. It'll be interesting to kind of look back on it a few years from now and see if much has changed. Definitely. So I think for my first story of this episode, I wanted to highlight a new story I noticed that came out just this week about a guy called Abu Bakr Salim. Do you know who that is, Matt?
No.
You might know if I say Assassin's Creed Origins.
Is he the actor who plays Basim? Not Basim.
Bayek. Yes,
Bayek.
They have similar names. Yes, he would be the voice of Bayek. But he has just released a game that he has been working on, essentially. And you might remember, because it's in the article, in the Game Awards last year in December, he kind of debuted the game in a speech, and he was incredibly emotional because he was talking about how much it would mean to his father, who had recently passed away, and how the game was about that grief, or at least I can't remember how many years ago it was his father passed away, but it was almost like a tribute to his father, the game, and it's called Tales of Kenzera. Zao, I'll spell that. So that's Kenzera is Kenzera, and then it's got a colon ZAU. And it's interesting because what it does is it's centering a black African man as like the main character, and it's all about African myth and legend and how the tradition of storytelling, oral storytelling, and it takes a look at that really, which I think sounds like a fascinating game. And I just wanted to take a moment to kind of read about it and highlight it as a game that we might want to check out in future. But yes, he is a British actor, soon to appear in House of the Dragon, apparently, if any of you watched that. So Tales of Kenzera has had a 4-year development cycle, and obviously was announced at the Game Awards last year. And it is to do with the game's title character called Zhao, a young shaman who has lost his father. Unable to accept it, he summons the god of death and goes on a quest to bring his dad back to life, which sounds very cool. It's about a young boy who's grieving, Abu has told the article reporter. So it looks quite a colourful game. I'll see if I can find a picture just to show you. It won't be very good for our audio listeners, but it should give you an idea of how lovely and light and colourful it looks.
Yes, that's a nice colour scheme. So we've got, it looks like a blue talisman and an orange talisman on either sides, and he's got, that's a really nice character art.
Yeah, it's really sort of it's definitely more artsy than realistic, I would say. But it says he's a shaman who uses powers bestowed upon him by two mystical masks, and one looks like a snake and the other one looks like possibly a lion, but it has horns, so I'm not entirely sure. The orange one is the liony looking one, but it looks really, really cool. But yeah, it's developed in partnership with Melanin Games, and I'll just try and find the quote from the lady about inclusivity in games and representation in games, because I think that's very relevant to what we like to talk about on the podcast here. Basically, the plot of the game was really heavily inspired by Abu's own experiences growing up. His grandfather was a Ganga, so I apologise for probably really horribly pronouncing that, but it's spelled Nganga, which is a traditional spiritual healer, which is really cool. So his father would share really cool words and ideas with him, and kind of tell the stories of his grandfather and kind of pass it down through the generations. So the game does a lot about like that side of African culture, and you can also play with Swahili dialogue, which he thinks is a really authentic way to play it. Obviously, relying heavily on African mythology is quite unusual to see in video games. I don't think I've ever seen any other video games covering that topic. And there's a lady called Annabelle Ashley Anthony, who is the founder of Melanin Gamers, which advocates for more inclusivity in the industry, and obviously was a fan of Abu since she realised he was the voice of Bayek in Assassin's Creed Origins. So she's saying that basically seeing him present the game at the Game Awards really resonated with her because of that representation, and I think it's really important to kind of highlight that as well, having a black character as the main character in a video game. The article mentions it being the Black Panther of video games, which will be interesting. It'll be really cool to see. I'm not sure if the game is out just right now or if it's coming out imminently, but I'd be really interested in playing it just to see what kind of vibes it gives off in terms of if it's similar to Black Panther in that way, as a real celebration of black culture and things like that, and kind of, not being there for a tokenistic way. Does that make sense, Matt?
Yeah,
do you reckon?
There's a good, another part of a good trend seems to be that, have you watched any of Shogun?
No, but I'd like to. It looks really good.
So the lead actor Hiroyuki Sanada, he's an icon of Japanese cinema. He's been acting for decades, and he was in The Last Samurai, Tom Cruise film, and now he's in Shogun. And this was a Japanese-led show. This was proper Japanese people portraying Japanese culture, with them being in charge, and the one white Englishman is literally just there to sort of be the voice of the audience, going, what the hell's going on? Because 90% of it's in Japanese. Completely alien. But that's a sign of samurais have been done to death, but they've almost always been, the biggest versions have only been white people's romanticising of them and simplifying of them. But with this, it's African people telling stories about African culture, rather than there are the exceptions to this, which are fucking Alexander Villeneuve in Dune, somehow managing to cast only white people in a desert film where it is all stolen from.
What about
Muslim,
the guy who
African
plays
stuff, Middle Eastern stuff?
What's his name? Is he not mixed race?
I've not watched it.
Oh.
I can't bear it because
Okay.
it's so much whiteness.
I didn't mind it. I mean, it wasn't like amazing. I mean, it was very impressive and cinematic. But I think it went on a little bit too long. But it wasn't awful. It wasn't like Avatar levels of awful. But yeah, it wasn't. I was slightly underwhelmed. I think there was a lot of hype around it, and I was expecting it to be something I'd absolutely love. But I mean, I don't hate it, but I don't. I enjoyed it, but I didn't love it 100% madly. But yeah,
that director is approaching Christopher Nolan levels of my irritation.
Yeah.
But I think with at least Christopher Nolan makes movies full of white men about white men. So he does that. But what James Cameron and Alex Villeneuve do is they take indigenous cultures. With James Cameron, he makes them blue and makes white people play them. Alex Villeneuve just cuts through.
Dennis? I thought it was Dennis. Dennis, what
did I say?
You said Alex.
Dennis Villeneuve.
I think so.
I
could be wrong.
What he does is literally just take a culture of people of colour and make them all white.
Yeah.
And
Zendaya's mixed race, isn't she? I would assume. Yeah.
She is.
But yeah.
So that's one thing out of a sea of white people. And it's unbelievable. I remember when the first film came out, someone asked him, isn't this just a white saviour story? And he said, no, it's actually a sort of a reverse of it, seeing how difficult it is for a white saviour to come in. And then in this film, they literally call him, it's like the Muad'Dib or something.
Lesson al-Ghaib.
And that's literally a Muslim word for like, it wouldn't surprise me if it was white saviour.
No, it's something like he who comes from another world or something like that. But it's basically more or less. Yeah. No, I've thought about it. I'm like, oh wait, no. Yeah. I see your point. But yeah. Interestingly though,
and just think,
oh no, go on, Matt.
Just the waste of an opportunity for that, because he could have filled it to the rafters with Middle Eastern actors, and it would have been exactly the same film, just groundbreakingly new in terms, because people don't see Middle Eastern architecture very much, Middle Eastern life very much.
No.
So what studios have always done is say, we'll take the culture, that's awesome, and we'll just put white people there instead. And just to have no one at any point in the development process go, maybe we shouldn't have all of them be white, everyone. Maybe we could have it, and that not just completely not occur in the slightest is unbelievable.
But no, I just have some more to say about the, or at least not me, but the people in the article have to say about the impact of Black Panther, and how it's perhaps inspired games like this. The lady who I mentioned, Annabelle, her brother Alan, who also runs Melanin Gamers, says about the cultural movement that built up behind the film and how he thinks it's opened the floodgates for games like Zoud to come about. So he said that when these kinds of projects come onto the big stage, blow everybody's shutters wide open, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's massive potential there, let's capitalise. A lot of people, their first instinct would be Egyptian mythology, and they think that's the only mythology that the African continent has to offer. But there's a really massive untapped market when it comes to African mythology as a whole. And Abu said it was important to him to honour and respect Bantu culture, as seen in Tales of Kenzera, and celebrate it, because you don't really necessarily see a lot of it, which I thought was interesting to read about as well. But yeah, it's also slightly I don't know if I enjoy the phrase untapped market as if it's like a commodity. I don't want it to be, mythologies to become commodities. To be fair though, gaming is kind of built on exploring loads of different types of mythologies. Like obviously Greek mythology is massive in gaming, Norse mythology, thank you God of War. Everyone loves mythologies generally, but yeah, there's some slightly capitalist edges to like marketing it as a untapped whatever. That kind of slightly make me feel a little bit wary, but I'm really glad that it exists as a game, and I'm really keen to check it out, I think. So, did you have any other points you wanted to make about that, or are you happy to move on to your second story of the day?
I think I'm happy to move on.
Cool. Okay.
Right. Can we stop?
Of course. Yeah.
Pause the recording, and because I've got a picture to